The notice came on a Tuesday, which was the same day Renata Voss discovered that her debit card had $12.31 on it, and that the electricity would be shut off by Friday if she didn't make a payment of $247 she did not have. She stood at the kitchen counter of the apartment she could no longer afford, the disconnection notice on the table in front of her, the phone pressed to her ear, while the automated payment system repeated its options in a voice that managed to be both cheerful and devastating. Her daughter, Maisie, sat cross-legged on the floor, doing homework by the window because the overhead bulb in her bedroom had burned out 2 weeks ago, and the replacement bulb was one of those purchases that kept getting pushed to next week. Maisie was 8 years old, and she had learned not to ask about the bulb anymore. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. Renata hung up without making a payment she couldn't make and stood very still for a moment looking at nothing. Outside the window, the sky over Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was the particular gray of November, the kind that settled in and stayed, and the radiator along the wall was making its ticking and knocking sounds that meant it was working, but only barely, that the heat was something you had to listen for rather than feel. She had been in this apartment for 11 months. Before that, she and Maisie had spent 6 weeks in a Motel 6 off the interstate, and before that they had been in the house that used to be her house, the one on Clement Street with the porch and the yard and Maisie's growth chart penciled on the doorframe of the kitchen, until the divorce was finalized and the equity was split and her share of nothing was exactly that. She was 36 years old. She had been a licensed electrician for 9 years, the kind of work she had loved before she took time away when Maisie was born and discovered that coming back to the trade with a 2-year gap and an ex-husband who had told every contractor in the county that she was unreliable was harder than she had anticipated. She had 3 part-time jobs now: a hardware store 4 mornings a week, a cleaning service 2 evenings, online data entry when Maisie was asleep, and Renata could sit at the kitchen table with the laptop balanced on a stack of textbooks and get through another 4 hours before her eyes gave out. None of it added up the way it was supposed to. The numbers did not work no matter how many times she ran them. Maisie looked up from the floor. She had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that shifted depending on the light, and she had her mother's habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard about something. "Is it bad?" Maisie asked. Renata folded the notice and put it face down on the counter. "We're going to be fine." Maisie looked at her for a moment in that way she had, assessing, patient. Then she went back to her homework. She was in 3rd grade and she was reading at a 5th grade level, and she had a best friend named Danny whose mother had stopped inviting Maisie to birthday parties, Renata suspected, because the last time Renata had been asked to contribute to a class gift, she had handed over $4 in quarters that she'd counted out from the dish on the counter, and the expression on Danny's mother's face had communicated everything. The letter from the county assessor's office arrived 3 days later, tucked between a credit card offer and a water bill. It was addressed to Renata Voss, which meant it was intended for her rather than the previous tenant, which was unusual. She opened it standing at the mailbox in the apartment building's entryway. It was not from the assessor's office, she saw quickly. That was just the processing address used for official correspondence. The actual letter was from a firm called Hadley, Cross and Morrow, attorneys at law, out of Dunnfield, Pennsylvania, a town Renata knew the name of only because it was on the same county map as the town where she'd grown up. The letter informed her that she had been identified as the sole living heir of one Gerald Emmett Voss, her father's older brother, deceased 6 weeks prior at the age of 79. Gerald had left no spouse, no children, and no will, which meant the estate had gone to probate, and the probate court had gone looking for next of kin and found Renata. She had met Gerald Voss twice. Once at her grandfather's funeral when she was 11, when Gerald had stood at the back of the church and not spoken to anyone. Once at a family gathering some years later when he had sat alone at a picnic table and eaten his food and left without saying goodbye. She knew almost nothing about him except that he had been a machinist, that he had served in the army and come back from somewhere changed, that he had bought a piece of property in Dunnfield County decades ago and lived there alone, and that her father had described him as someone who preferred his own company. The property in question, the letter explained, consisted of a 19th-century mill building on 11 acres along the Caro Creek, with the mill structure itself containing approximately 4,000 square feet across 2 floors plus a functioning basement level. a mill pond that had partially silted over, a stone outbuilding, and the original millrace still intact though not operational. The property had been assessed for tax purposes at $31,000, a number that reflected its state of disrepair rather than any realistic market value. There were no outstanding liens. There was no mortgage. The property, if Renata chose to accept the inheritance, would transfer to her free and clear upon completion of the required documentation. The letter also noted that the mill had not been used commercially in several decades, and that the structural condition was described in the inspection addendum as requiring significant remediation before any habitable or operational use. Renata read the letter twice on the cold tile floor of the entryway. Then she put it in her pocket and went upstairs and looked at the electricity disconnection notice still face down on the counter and thought for a long time. She called the number on the letterhead the next morning from the hardware store's break room. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Cross who sounded about 60, was brisk and businesslike and answered Renata's questions without judgment. The property was real. The transfer was straightforward. The assessed value was accurate and the inspection report was thorough. The mill building had a roof that needed substantial repair, no functioning plumbing, no electrical service, a foundation that was sound on 3 corners and questionable on the 4th, and what the inspector had described as extensive accumulated material throughout the interior, nature and extent unverified. What does that mean? Renata asked. Accumulated material. It means no one has been inside in some years, Patricia Cross said. Your uncle kept the exterior maintained, but the interior was locked. The inspector could only observe from the windows. How long was it locked? There was a pause. Based on the padlock hardware and the weathering pattern, the inspector estimated somewhere between 20 and 40 years. Renata was quiet for a moment. There's something else, Cross said. Your uncle left a sealed envelope with our office. He left instructions that it was to be given only to whoever inherited the property, and only in person. If you want the envelope, you'll need to come to our office. Renata went back to the hardware store floor and spent the rest of the morning restocking a shelf of pipe fittings and thinking about a mill she had never seen and an uncle she barely knew and a sealed envelope waiting in a law office 40 miles away. She told her sister about it that evening. Her sister Bev lived in Maryland and had a life that looked from the outside like the life Renata was supposed to have, a house and a husband and 2 kids and activities. And Bev had been kind during the divorce in the careful way that people were kind when they felt that the disaster was at least partly the other person's fault. Renata had borrowed $300 from Bev in September to cover Maisie's school fees and had not been able to pay it back. An old mill, Bev said. What are you going to do with an old mill? I don't know yet. Is it worth anything? Assessed at $31,000. But the building's in rough shape. Renata. Bev's voice had that particular tone. A falling down mill in the middle of nowhere is not going to solve your problems. You need actual money. Have you looked into whether Dad's pension has anything left in it? I've looked into everything, Bev. I'm just saying. You can't live in a mill. I'm not saying I'm going to live in it. Then what are you saying? Renata didn't have an answer for that. What she had was the feeling she'd had reading that letter in the entryway. Something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. The sense that a door had opened somewhere in a long hallway of closed doors, and that whether she walked through it or not was the only question that actually mattered. She told Maisie about the mill at dinner. She did not frame it as a solution or a plan. She described it as an old building on a creek that had belonged to her uncle and that now belonged to them. Maisie thought about this for a moment, spoon suspended over her soup. Like a water wheel mill. Yes. Does the wheel still work? I don't know. Nobody's been inside in a long time. Why not? I don't know that either. That's one of the things we'd have to find out. Maisie set her spoon down and looked at her mother. Are we going to go see it? I think we have to. Maisie picked her spoon back up. Okay, she said. This was the thing about Maisie. She processed change quickly, assessed the situation with her gray-green eyes, and then made a decision about whether to be afraid of it. She had decided not to be afraid of much since the divorce. Renata suspected this was because Maisie had made a calculation somewhere around age 7 that fear was not a useful tool given current circumstances. They drove to Dunnfield on a Saturday in Renata's car that burned oil slowly and made a sound on cold mornings that the mechanic had described as not immediately dangerous. The day was overcast, the kind of cold that came up through the floorboards, and Maisie sat in the passenger seat with a notebook in her lap, drawing maps of what she imagined the mill would look like. She drew water wheels. She drew the mill pond. She drew a stone building with a door standing open. Patricia Cross's office was on the main street of Dunnfield in a building that had been a bank a long time ago and still had the teller windows along one wall. Cross herself was exactly what she had sounded like on the phone, efficient and precise with silver hair cut short and reading glasses on a chain. She had the paperwork ready and walked Renata through it in the same businesslike way, pointing out the relevant clauses, explaining the probate completion timeline, not making Renata feel foolish for asking questions. When the documents were signed, Cross opened her desk drawer and took out an envelope. It was a standard business envelope, white and slightly yellowed with age, sealed with tape that had also yellowed. On the front, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, a machinist's printing, it said, "For whoever inherits the mill. Read this before you go inside." Renata held it in both hands. "Do you know what's in it?" "No. Gerald delivered it himself about 8 years ago. He said it was instructions." "Instructions for what?" "He didn't say." Cross looked at her steadily. "I will tell you that in 30 years of estate law, I've handled a fair number of properties with unusual circumstances. Your uncle struck me, on the occasions I met him, as a man who was very careful and very methodical. Whatever he wanted you to know, I imagine it's in there." Renata put the envelope in her coat pocket. She could feel it there, a small square of pressure against her ribs, all the way through the conversation and all the way to the car. Maisie was sitting in the passenger seat with her notebook, and she looked up when Renata got in. "Can we go see it now?" "In a minute." Renata took out the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds, the same handwriting, more of it. She read, "If you're reading this, you're the one who got the property. I don't know who you are, but your family, and you found your way here, so that's something. There are things you need to know before you go into the mill. First, the building is sound except the northeast corner of the foundation, which I marked with orange paint in 1987. Don't put weight on that section. The rest is solid. Second, the main floor lever on the east wall controls the millrace gate. Don't touch it. The pond has 20-some years of silt and debris upstream, and if you open that gate without clearing the channel, first you'll flood the basement. The basement is where everything is. Third, there is a combination lock on the basement door. The combination is the year the mill was built plus the year I was born in sequence. You can find the mill's build year on the cornerstone by the north entrance. Fourth, I want you to know that what's in the basement is legal. Every piece of it. I worked for it honestly, and I kept it because I didn't trust banks after 1987, and I didn't have family worth trusting it to until I got old enough to stop being angry. I'm leaving this to you because you're left. I'm sorry I wasn't better at being a person. The money is real. The documentation is in the green metal cabinet, third drawer, under the workbench. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't yours. G.V. Renata read it 3 times. Her hands were very steady, which surprised her. "Mom," Maisie said. "What does it say?" Renata folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Then she started the car. "It says your great-uncle left us something in the basement," she said, "and we need to go find out what it is." The mill was 6 miles outside Dunnfield on a county road that wound along the creek, the trees bare on both sides with the particular skeletal clarity of late November, and Renata drove slowly because the road had frost heaves, and because she wanted to be careful, and because some part of her needed time to exist in the space before she knew what was waiting. Maisie had stopped drawing and was watching the road. They smelled the creek before they saw the property, that cold mineral smell of moving water over stone, and then the road curved and the tree line opened, and there it was. The mill sat at the bend where the creek widened before the mill pond, a 4-story stone building with a slate roof, the stone the color of old pewter, the mortar lines dark with age and damp. It was large, larger than Renata had imagined, the kind of building that had been built to last centuries and had managed it. The water wheel was on the north side, iron-rimmed and enormous, still and rusted but not collapsed, each paddle intact. The mill pond was behind it, the surface still and dark, the far bank thicket with dried cattails. A wooden footbridge crossed the tail race. The stone outbuilding was 20 feet from the main structure, smaller, its roof intact. The property had the quality of something held suspended, not neglected in the way of places abandoned to chaos, but still in the way of places deliberately closed. The grass in the yard, long dead for winter, had grown tall, but not wild. The gate in the low stone wall around the property was shut, but not locked. Someone had cared for the exterior. The letter had said as much, and you could see it in the way the building sat, maintained at the level of someone who wanted it to last but did not want it entered. Maisie was out of the car before Renata had fully stopped it, standing on the frost-stiff grass with her head tilted back, looking up at the water wheel. "It's huge," she said. "It is. Is that the mill pond?" "Yes." Maisie walked toward the water wheel without being told she could. Renata followed, holding the letter in her pocket. The cornerstone by the north entrance had the year in incised numerals, 1847. Renata did the arithmetic. Gerald Voss had been born in 1945. The combination was 1847 and 1945. She found the orange paint on the northeast foundation corner, a faded X at the base of the stone where the mortar had crept slightly. She stayed away from that corner. The front door of the mill was padlocked with a heavy brass lock. The attorney had provided 2 keys, and the second one opened it. Inside, the smell hit her first. Not rot or mildew, which she had expected, but something more complicated: stone and old wood and machine oil, and a faint metallic undertone she couldn't immediately name. The light through the windows, high and small on the thick stone walls, was dim and gray, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. The main floor was vast. The millstones were still there, 2 of them, the massive runner stones still seated on the bedstone, the wooden machinery around them largely intact, the great gear assembly above connecting to the shaft that ran to the wheel. There were wooden bins along the walls, empty. There were workbenches with tools on them, organized with precision, the tools dusty but not rusted. There was a coating of old flour dust in the corners still, despite the decades, white-gray and soft as ash. Along the east wall, exactly where Gerald's letter had described, was the lever. It was cast iron, mounted on a pivot plate bolted to the stone, its handle worn smooth by decades of use, and beside it someone had stenciled in red paint the word "stop" in block letters. Under that, in the same careful machinist's printing Renata recognized from the letter, "Do not operate without clearing the race channel. Basement flooding hazard." Maisie was standing next to her mother looking at the lever with the focused expression she used for problems that interested her. "That's the one from the letter," she said. "Yes." "Can I touch it?" "No." Maisie nodded, accepting this without argument. She had already understood, Renata thought, that this place had rules that needed to be respected before anything else happened here. The basement door was in the back corner of the main floor, heavy wood bound in iron straps, with the combination lock exactly where Gerald had said it would be. Renata stood in front of it with the flashlight she had taken from the car and worked the numbers. 1-8-4-7, then 1-9-4-5. The lock opened. The door was heavy on its iron hinges. It swung inward and cold air came up from below, not damp cold the way she had expected, but the dry cold of stone and controlled temperature, the cold of a space that had been sealed and maintained and was exactly the temperature it was supposed to be. The stairs were stone, hand-cut, descending in a straight run. Renata went first with the flashlight and Maisie came behind her, one hand on the wall, quiet. The basement was the full footprint of the building, the ceiling supported by stone pillars, the floor packed earth worn hard as concrete. It was not a damp cellar. It was a workshop, or had been, and it was full. Renata stood at the bottom of the stairs with the flashlight beam moving slowly across the space and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Along the right wall were wooden shelves, floor to ceiling, the kind built to last, the wood thick and the joints pegged rather than nailed. On the shelves were wooden crates of various sizes, each one stenciled with dates and numbers, each one sealed. Along the left wall were metal cabinets, green and heavy, the institutional kind, and beside them 3 workbenches with equipment on them that Renata's electrician's eyes recognized as testing and measurement instruments, most of them from the mid-20th century, some of them older. In the center of the room, covered with canvas tarps, were large shapes she couldn't immediately identify. The green metal cabinets. 3rd drawer, under the workbench. She found the right cabinet and opened the drawer and took out a leather portfolio, old and worn but intact, the kind with a zipper around 3 sides. Inside were papers, dozens of them, organized in labeled sections with the meticulous care of someone who had spent their life doing precise work. She brought the portfolio to the nearest workbench and opened it under the flashlight. The first section was labeled Provenance and Documentation. Behind the label was a typed cover sheet that said, "This collection was assembled legally and documented in full. All transactions were conducted in accordance with applicable law. Copies of all acquisition records are contained within this portfolio. The collection consists of military surplus material, historical artifacts, and related assets acquired between 1968 and 2001 through government auction, estate sale, private purchase, and direct acquisition under Federal Surplus Property Act authorizations." Renata stopped reading and looked up at the covered shapes in the middle of the room. She put down the portfolio and walked to the nearest tarp and lifted the edge of it. Underneath was a vehicle, specifically a half-track armored personnel carrier, olive drab, the paint faded but intact, the steel body solid, the running gear complete. It was in extraordinary condition. It looked as if someone had stored it here with the intention of driving it out again someday. She let the tarp fall and stood back and looked at the room with new eyes. There were 7 covered shapes she could count. She walked to each one and lifted the edge of the tarp just enough to see. A second half-track, a field artillery piece, a 75mm howitzer, the wheels solid rubber, the breech intact. 2 military motorcycles, side by side, the kind from the Second World War. A small tracked vehicle she eventually identified from its shape as a Weasel cargo carrier. And at the far end of the room, larger than the others, what turned out under the canvas to be an early model military jeep in a state of preservation, so complete it appeared to have been parked here last Tuesday rather than 40 years ago. Maisie stood in the middle of the room with her flashlight, turning slowly, taking everything in with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. "These are from the war," she said. "The Second World War, I think. Some of them. They're in really good shape." "Yes." Renata was looking at the wooden crates on the shelves. She went to the one nearest to her and examined the stenciling. It said, "Contents, small arms components, and ON operational. Deactivated per ATF compliance. Date, September 14th, 1979. Below that were reference numbers. She went to the portfolio and found the section labeled Deactivation Certifications and matched the reference number and found the document. An official ATF Form 2 from 1979 with Gerald Voss's name on it, and a government stamp and a compliance signature. Everything was documented. Every crate on those shelves had a corresponding entry in that portfolio. Gerald had not merely acquired these things. He had cataloged them with the precision of an archivist and the legal care of someone who knew exactly what he had and exactly how to protect his ownership of it. She went back to the portfolio and found the section labeled Appraisals. There were 3 sets of appraisals, each from a different appraiser. The most recent dated 2003. She turned pages with hands that had gone very still, the way her hands went when she needed steadiness. The most recent appraisal listed 47 items with individual assessments. The half-tracks were appraised at $65,000 each. The howitzer at $140,000. The Weasel at $82,000. The Jeep at $55,000. The motorcycles together at $90,000. Then the crates, deactivated firearms with provenance documentation, appraised in aggregate at $430,000. Military equipment and components, appraised in aggregate at $820,000. Historical artifacts and militaria, appraised in aggregate at $1.1 million. But it was the final section of the appraisal that made Renata sit down on the cold stone floor. The last 14 entries were not vehicles or weaponry or militaria. They were financial instruments. U.S. Treasury bonds in physical certificate form, Series E and Series H, issued between 1944 and 1968, held in a fireproof safe that Renata had not yet found. The appraiser had noted that the bonds were fully intact, properly registered, and had been accruing interest since issuance. The face values were considerable. The accrued interest over 50-some years of compounding was something else entirely. The appraiser had done the arithmetic as of 2003. Total redemption value of bond portfolio at time of appraisal, $274 million. The appraisal was 20 years old. The bonds had kept accruing. Renata sat on the stone floor of the basement with the flashlight in her lap and the portfolio open in front of her and did not move for a very long time. Maisie came and sat down next to her. She looked at the number on the page that Renata was looking at. She was 8 years old, and she had been doing multiplication in school since second grade, and she understood large numbers the way children who grew up without money understood them, with a combination of abstract comprehension and deep personal context. "Mom," Maisie said. "Yes. Is that how much it's worth?" "That's from 20 years ago. It would be more now." Maisie was quiet for a moment. "Then, is it really ours?" Renata looked at the documentation in her hands, the decades of careful record-keeping, the legal forms, and the compliance certifications, and the appraisals, and the cover letter that said in Gerald Voss's careful handwriting that the money was real and the documentation was in the green metal cabinet, and not to let anyone tell her it wasn't hers. "It's really ours," she said. Maisie leaned against her mother's arm. They sat together on the basement floor of the old mill in the gray November cold with the flashlight making a circle of light around them, and the covered shapes of Gerald's 40-year collection ranged in the dark beyond it. They drove back to the apartment in Harrisburg that night, and Renata did not tell anyone. She needed to think, needed to understand the shape of what had happened before she let other people's reactions reshape it. She fed Maisie dinner and helped her with a worksheet on fractions, and then sat at the kitchen table after Maisie was asleep and reread Gerald's letter 6 times. She called Patricia Cross in the morning and asked 2 questions. First, was there anything in the estate documentation she needed to be aware of that might complicate the transfer or the ownership of the mill's contents? Cross said she would need to review the probate record against the property description, but that in her initial assessment, no, the transfer appeared clean. Second, Renata asked if Cross could recommend an attorney who specialized in military surplus and historical artifact law, someone who would understand the specific legal landscape of what she had found. Cross was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "I take it the inspection addendum's description of accumulated material was somewhat of an understatement." "Yes," Renata said. "I'll make some calls," Cross said. The attorney Cross recommended was a man named Dale Harwick in Philadelphia who had spent 20 years as a JAG officer before going into private practice and whose firm handled, among other things, the sale of decommissioned military equipment and the legal transfer of historical military artifacts. Renata spoke with him on a Wednesday and described, carefully, what she had found. Harwick listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "The documentation you're describing," he said. "The ATF compliance forms, the government auction receipts, the bond certificates. How thorough is it?" "Every item has a corresponding record. The portfolio is organized by date of acquisition and cross-referenced by category." "And the bonds? You said there's Series E and Series H." "Yes. Series E stopped being issued in 1980. The Treasury Department has a redemption program for legacy bonds. They've been running it since the early 2000s. It's not complicated, but it requires the original certificates and a chain of ownership documentation." "There's a chain," Renata said. "It goes back to original issuance. All of them are registered in Gerald Voss's name, and the portfolio includes the registration confirmations." There was another pause. "Ms. Voss, how did you say you were related to the deceased?" "He was my father's brother. We barely knew each other." "I see." Harwick's voice had the particular quality of a man who had seen a great deal in his professional life and had learned to be careful about projecting reaction. "What I need you to do is not touch anything, not move anything, and not discuss this with anyone except Patricia Cross and me. Can you do that?" "Yes. And I need you to understand that what you're describing, if it is what you're describing, is going to require a very careful and methodical process. There are legal steps that have to happen in a specific order. There will be appraisals and verifications and tax implications and a transfer process for the bonds that involves the Treasury Department directly. None of it is impossible. All of it takes time. But if the documentation is as complete as you say it is, none of it should be a problem." "Okay," Renata said. "Can you get back to the mill without telling anyone where you're going or why?" "Yes. I'd like to meet you there this Friday. I want to see the documentation myself before we do anything else." She went back to the hardware store on Thursday morning and worked her shift and stocked the shelves of pipe fittings and said nothing to anyone. In the break room at lunch, she called the electricity company and made the minimum payment to stop the disconnection using $31 she had moved from an account she hadn't touched in 3 months. Then she went back to the floor and finished her shift. Maisie had a school event on Thursday evening, a class presentation. and Renata sat in the gymnasium of the school with the other parents and watched Maisie stand at the front of the room and deliver a 3-minute presentation on the water cycle with the same composed self-possession she brought to everything and thought. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. This is going to be different. I don't know yet what different looks like, but it is going to be different. She had not called Bev. She had not called anyone in the family. She had reread Gerald's letter enough times that she had it memorized, and she kept returning to 2 lines. I'm leaving this to you because you're left. I'm sorry I wasn't better at being a person. She knew something about not being better at being a person. About the gap between the kind of presence you wanted to be for the people you were supposed to care for and the kind you actually managed. Gerald had been a soldier and a machinist, and a man who lived alone and locked his basement and spent 40 years building something he never spent. She did not understand him fully, but she understood the impulse to keep building quietly when the world was not paying attention, to work towards something you couldn't quite name, to trust that it would matter eventually even when eventually seemed very far away. Harwick arrived on Friday morning in a dark sedan. He was 60, compact, with the bearing of someone who had spent a career making precise assessments under pressure. He shook Renata's hand without any kind of performance, looked at the mill building with a professional eye, and said simply, "Okay, show me." They went through the front door and down to the basement, and Harwick stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets looking at the covered shapes and the shelved crates and the green metal cabinets. Then he said, "The documentation." Renata handed him the portfolio. He went through it section by section at the workbench while Renata waited. He was methodical and thorough, and he read carefully, and he did not make sounds of surprise or admiration. He cross-referenced entries against the labels on the crates. He examined the ATF compliance forms closely. He spent the most time in the bond section, going through each certificate record and comparing it against the registration confirmations. After 40 minutes, he closed the portfolio and held it for a moment. "I've handled significant military surplus collections before," he said. "I've handled bond portfolios from this era. I've handled historical vehicle collections. I've never seen all 3 together in one place with documentation this complete. Is everything in order? Based on what's here, yes. This will require independent verification by specialists in each category, which I'll arrange. The bond redemption process will need to go through Treasury and will involve their Historical Securities Division. The vehicle and artifact appraisals will need to be updated. The 2003 numbers are substantially out of date for this market." He paused. The bond interest accrual alone, based on the portfolio face value and issuance dates, would be significant. I can't give you a number today, but I can tell you it will be above what the 2003 appraisal reflected. Renata was looking at the covered shapes. How long will the verification process take? 6 to 8 weeks minimum for the bonds. The vehicle and artifact market has a different timeline, potentially longer, depending on how you want to approach disposition versus retention. Some of these, depending on condition and provenance, would be of interest to museums. Gerald's letter says the documentation is in order, that it's all legal. His documentation supports that conclusion. The question for my purposes isn't whether Gerald was honest. I believe he was, but whether the paper trail is complete enough to withstand the scrutiny it will receive. Based on what I've seen this morning, I think it is. He looked at her steadily. Ms. Voss, I want to be clear with you. The process ahead is real, and it takes time, and it will have costs. But what you're looking at here is a substantial and legally protected estate. Your uncle built something over 40 years, and he left it to you. The number at the end of this is going to be significant. How significant? Harwick was quiet for a moment. I'd want the updated appraisals before I give you a figure. But the bond portfolio alone, with accrual to present day, is in the range of $350 to $400 million. The vehicles and artifacts are additional to that. The number sat in the cold air of the basement. Okay, Renata said. Harwick almost smiled. You're taking this remarkably calmly. I've been thinking about it for a week, she said. I've had some time. He left with the portfolio in a document bag, promising to have his specialists in contact within the week. Renata stood alone in the basement for a few minutes after his car left. She looked at the covered shapes. She thought about Gerald Voss, who had been a machinist and a veteran and a man who preferred his own company, who had spent 4 decades acquiring and cataloging and documenting and sealing, and who had finally, in his last years, decided to trust someone. She went upstairs and stood in the main floor of the mill and looked at the lever on the east wall. The word stop in red, Gerald's careful warning about the channel and the basement and the flooding risk. Don't touch it. The basement is where everything is. She had listened. She had done exactly what the letter said. She had found the combination and opened the door and looked at what was there without touching the lever, without flooding anything, without destroying the thing that needed to be found. Outside, the creek moved over its stones in the gray November cold. The water will stood still. The mill pond was dark and patient, waiting for whatever came next. Renata pulled out her phone and called Patricia Cross to confirm that the property transfer paperwork could proceed. Then she drove back to Harrisburg to pick up her daughter from school. She did not call Bev yet. She was not ready for Bev's voice, for the particular way Bev's concern would reshape itself once the numbers were involved. She needed another few days of quiet, of knowing this privately, of sitting with the size of it before the world got to have an opinion about it. Maisie was waiting outside the school when Renata pulled up, backpack on, notebook in hand, the collar of her winter coat slightly askew. She got in the car and looked at her mother. Did the lawyer come? He did. What did he say? Renata pulled away from the school and into the street. She kept her eyes on the road. He said your great-uncle was very careful and very honest, and that everything is exactly what the documents say it is. Maisie was quiet for a moment. Mom, she said, is it going to be okay? Renata thought about Gerald Voss spending 40 years building something alone in a stone basement. She thought about her daughter doing homework by the window because the ceiling bulb had burned out and she hadn't been able to buy a replacement. She thought about the electricity disconnection notice face down on the counter and the $12.31 and the way the apartment's radiator knocked and ticked through the night. Yes, she said. It's going to be okay. Maisie opened her notebook and picked up her pencil. Outside the window, Harrisburg moved past in its gray November way. The streets and the buildings and the cold, clear sky, all of it ordinary and familiar and, for now, still the same as it had always been. She did not know yet what it meant to be a person whose life could change completely on the strength of a letter and a combination lock and a sealed door in a stone basement. She was still the woman from the hardware store and the cleaning service and the late-night data entry, still the woman with $12 in her account and an electricity bill she couldn't pay. The process that Harwick had described would take months. The verification and the appraisals and the Treasury Department and the tax implications and the disposition decisions. All of it would come later, and it would be slow, and it would require patience. But the door in the basement was open now. Whatever was in there was real, and it was hers, and no one could take it back. She drove home through the gray November city, and the radiator was still knocking when they got back, and the ceiling bulb in Maisie's room was still burned out, and the disconnection notice was still face down on the counter. All of that was still true. But underneath all of it, quiet and solid and patient as the mill's stone foundations, something had changed that was not going to change back. Renata put the electricity bill in the recycling bin. She stood in the kitchen for a moment looking out the window at the gray city. Then she went to the closet and got out a fresh light bulb and carried it to Maisie's room and stood on the chair and screwed it into the fixture and pulled the cord. The room filled with light. Maisie looked up from her notebook, surprised, and then pleased in the way children are pleased by small things when small things have been in short supply. Finally, Maisie said. Finally, Renata agreed. She went back to the kitchen and sat down at the table and picked up her phone and looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it back down. She would call Harwick tomorrow. She would go over the next steps, the timeline, the process. She would begin learning the language of appraisals and bond redemption and estate transfer. But tonight she sat in the kitchen with the light on in her daughter's room and the sound of Maisie's pencil moving across paper and the radiator doing its small and inadequate best, and she let herself feel, carefully and completely, the strange and enormous thing that had happened to them in a stone basement along the Caro Creek. Gerald Voss had been a machinist. He had been a soldier. He had been a man who preferred his own company and had not been better at being a person than he wanted to be. And he had spent 40 years building something in a place no one had thought to look, and at the end of it he had left a letter that said, "Don't let anyone tell you it isn't yours." She was not going to let anyone tell her that. The verification process began the following week and moved with the methodical inevitability of legal processes that have all the documentation they need. Harwick's specialists came in sequence. First, the military historian from Philadelphia, who spent a full day in the basement with a clipboard and a camera documenting each vehicle and each crate, emerging at dusk with an expression Renata read as controlled excitement and saying only that he would have a preliminary report within 2 weeks. Then the firearms compliance attorney who reviewed the ATF certifications against current law and confirmed that the deactivation documentation was fully valid and that the collection was legally held. Then the Treasury Department contact, a woman named Wills from the Historical Securities Division who flew in from Washington with a colleague and spent 3 hours with the bond certificates, verifying registration records and matching them against federal issuance logs. Wills called Renata 4 days later and said in a measured voice that the bond certificates were valid, fully registered, and eligible for redemption. She said that the accrual calculation was complex and that the official figure would come from Treasury's bond value calculator applied to each certificate individually, but that her preliminary estimate placed the redemption value between $360 and $390 million, depending on the precise accrual dates. Renata was at the hardware store when the call came, and she took it in the back room near the mop storage and leaned against the concrete block wall and looked at the fluorescent light fixture on the ceiling and breathed. "The estate transfer is still processing," she said. "How long before redemption can begin?" "Once we have confirmed ownership documentation from the probate court, which typically takes 4 to 6 weeks from completion, the redemption process itself takes between 30 and 90 days per certificate batch. Given the volume, here we process them in batches. You're looking at a minimum of 6 months from ownership confirmation to full redemption." 6 months. 6 months of still being the woman from the hardware store and the cleaning service. "Okay," Renata said. "Ms. Voss, I want to make sure you understand the scale of what we're discussing. This is not a typical bond redemption situation. Our office deals with historical securities regularly, but the portfolio you've inherited is, in terms of both volume and accrued value, one of the larger individual holdings we've encountered in recent years. You're going to want to have your legal team in close communication with us throughout the process." "They will be. And you should know," Wills said, "that from our standpoint, everything is in order. Your uncle was meticulous. We don't usually say this, but whatever he was, whoever he was, he knew what he was doing." Renata hung up the phone and stood in the back room for another minute. Then she went back out to the hardware store floor and finished her shift. She had still not told Bev. She had not told anyone except Harwick and Cross and the specialists they brought in. The silence was deliberate. She needed the process to be far enough along that it was irreversible before other people's opinions about it could affect anything. She had learned this from the divorce, that other people's reactions could reshape your understanding of your own situation if you let them in too early, and she was not going to let that happen here. But the silence was also about something else. About not being ready yet for the world to know what she had. About the particular fragility of new fortune, the way it felt, before it was fully real, like something that could be taken back. She had spent 2 years losing things she had believed were solid, and the instinct to protect what she now had, to not expose it until it was too late for anyone to touch, was strong enough that she felt it as a physical caution, a keeping close of something precious. Maisie knew. Maisie was the only other person who knew, and Maisie had processed it with the same practical efficiency she brought to most things, and then gone back to school and her fractions worksheet and her best friend Danny, who was having a birthday party next month that Maisie had been invited to, and Renata had said yes. They would get Danny a real gift, a good one, because they could. That was the first change. A gift for Danny's birthday. Then the ceiling bulb in Maisie's room. Then the electricity bill paid in full. Small things. Things that cost less than $20 each. But they were a start, and they were hers, and she was paying for them from her own wages, from the hardware store, and the cleaning service, and the data entry, and the mill, and the basement, and the bonds were a thing she was managing carefully and legally, and she was not going to spend money she didn't yet have. She was still, every morning, the woman from the hardware store. That was what she held on to. That she was still herself, and that self was capable and careful, and had raised Maisie alone through 2 of the hardest years of both their lives. And that self was not going to be undone by $360 million. It was going to use $360 million to build something. She had started thinking about what that something might be. She had started thinking about it in the basement of the mill, actually, looking at the covered shapes and the shelved crates, and realizing that Gerald had built his collection one acquisition at a time over 40 years with no guarantee of outcome, and no one to tell him it was worth doing. He had done it because he believed in the thing he was making, in its value and its integrity and its legality, in his own careful judgment about what mattered. She wanted to build something with that same quality, something that would last. She was not sure yet what it was. She had a feeling it had something to do with the mill itself, with the building that Gerald had maintained and closed and left to her with instructions to find the basement before she touched the lever, with the water wheel that still stood and the millrace that could still carry water and the stone walls that had been solid for 175 years. But that was later. That was after the bonds were redeemed and the estate was fully transferred and the process was complete. That was after she knew the full shape of what she had. Right now she was still at the hardware store, stocking shelves of pipe fittings in the fluorescent light, and her daughter was at school, and the mill was sitting quiet by the Caro Creek with its doors locked and its basement sealed, and its water wheel still waiting. The call from Bev came on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after Renata had met with Harwick at the mill. Renata was at the kitchen table doing data entry when the phone lit up, and she looked at her sister's name for 2 rings before answering. Bev had heard from their cousin Dennis, who had heard from their Aunt Patrice, who had heard from someone at the county assessor's office in Dunnfield that Gerald Voss's estate had gone to probate and that a female relative had accepted the transfer. The information had moved through the family with the particular speed of information that involves property, which was faster than any other kind. Why didn't you tell me? Bev's voice was the careful version of hurt, the one that kept its tone neutral to hide the injury underneath. I'm still in the middle of the legal process. I didn't want to say anything until things were further along. How far along are they? Far enough that I can tell you now. There was a pause. So what is it? Patricia said it's an old mill building. It is an old mill building. Is it worth anything? Renata had thought about this moment, had rehearsed different versions of it. She said, the property is being appraised. It's too early to have a final number. This was true. It was not complete. But it's something. Not just a derelict building. It's something, yes. Another pause, longer. Then Bev said, Dennis thinks the family should be involved. He said Gerald was Dad's uncle, which means he was related to all of us. And if there's an estate worth anything, it should be discussed as a family. Renata set down her pen. Gerald left the property to me specifically. The probate court identified me as sole heir because I was the closest living relative. There's no family claim. I'm not saying there's a legal claim. I'm saying Dennis thinks we should talk about it. Dennis is welcome to think whatever he likes. Renata. Bev's voice shifted into the older sister register that Renata had been hearing since childhood, the one that implied Renata was being unnecessarily difficult about something obvious. I'm not the enemy here. I'm just saying that family is family, and if something good has happened for you, the people who care about you should be part of it. Renata thought about the $300 she had borrowed from Bev in September and had not been able to pay back, and about the way Bev's concern had always come packaged with a form of accounting, a ledger that ran underneath the surface of things. She thought about Dennis, who she had not spoken to in 4 years, and who had once, at a family gathering, spent 40 minutes explaining to her that the reason she was struggling financially was that she lacked discipline. She thought about Aunt Patrice, who had told Renata at the divorce proceedings that she was not surprised things had turned out this way. "I'll let you know when there's something definite to say," Renata said. "Right now everything is in process and I don't have final numbers, and I'm not in a position to have a family conversation about something that isn't fully resolved yet." Bev was quiet for a moment. "Are you doing okay?" "I'm doing okay. Maisie, she's good. She got an A on her science project." "That's great." Bev's voice softened. "Renata, I'm glad something good is happening for you. I really am. I just don't want you to make decisions in isolation and then have things get complicated later." "I have attorneys," Renata said. "I'm not making decisions in isolation." After she hung up, she sat for a moment looking at the kitchen wall. Then she called Harwick and left a voicemail asking him to confirm, at his earliest convenience, the precise legal boundaries of the inheritance and whether any other family member had grounds for any kind of claim. Harwick called back the next morning and said clearly and without qualification, no. The probate court had identified Renata as sole heir under Pennsylvania intestate succession law. The property and all its contents transferred to her exclusively. No family member had any legal standing to contest this. If anyone attempted to, the documentation was sufficiently robust to close such a challenge quickly. Renata thanked him and hung up and went to work. Dennis called 4 days later. She let it go to voicemail. The message he left was pleasant in the surface way of messages designed to establish a record of having been reasonable, explaining that he had been thinking about Uncle Gerald, whom he remembered fondly from family gatherings, and that he would love to connect and hear how Renata was doing and perhaps learn a little about the property she'd inherited. He mentioned, in passing, that he had some experience with estate management and would be happy to offer whatever help he could. She did not call back. What she did instead was make an appointment with a tax attorney in Philadelphia who specialized in large estate matters, a woman named Gloria Reyes who had been recommended by Harwick and whose hourly rate made Renata's eyes water, but who was, Harwick said, precisely the person she needed for the bond redemption tax implications. She drove to Philadelphia on a Tuesday morning and spent 2 hours in a conference room with a view of the Delaware River while Reyes walked her through the federal tax treatment of inherited Treasury bonds and the estate tax implications and the specific question of how to structure the redemption to minimize liability while remaining fully compliant. Reyes was thorough and direct and did not talk down to Renata, which Renata appreciated. She asked questions that got to the core of each issue, and when Renata didn't understand something, she said so, and Reyes explained it a different way without any sign of impatience. At the end of the meeting, Reyes looked across the conference table and said, "You're going to hear a lot of opinions from people about what you should do with this. Some of those people are going to tell you that they're trying to help. I want to be clear that my job is specifically to help you pay only what you legally owe and keep everything else. That's it. Everyone else has their own agenda, including people who will frame their agenda as being in your interest. Don't sign anything without running it by me first." "I understand," Renata said. "Good." Reyes closed her folder. "The other thing I want to say is that what you're describing, the documentation, the compliance history, the bond portfolio structure, is the result of someone who thought very carefully over a very long time. Your uncle understood what he was building, and he protected it legally at every step. He left you something that is as clean as inherited wealth gets. That's unusual, and it matters." Renata thought about Gerald in the basement with his catalogs and his compliance forms and his careful printing. "He was a machinist," she said, "and before that he was in the army. It shows," Reyes said. "Precision and documentation. That's what made this possible." The probate court completed its process 6 weeks after the initial filing, faster than expected because the documentation was complete and no one contested it. Renata received the formal ownership confirmation on a Wednesday afternoon, a thick envelope that contained the title transfer and the deed to the mill property and 11 acres along the Caro Creek. She sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time. She had paid the electricity bill in full. She had bought Maisie a proper winter coat, the kind with real insulation and a waterproof shell, at a department store rather than the thrift shop. She had replaced the burned-out bulb in Maisie's room and also the one in the bathroom that had been flickering for months. She had bought groceries in full rather than calculating every item against the remaining balance. These were not extravagances. They were the ordinary expenses of ordinary life, and she was paying for them from her wages, not from anything that wasn't hers yet. The bond redemption process began the following week. Wills from the Treasury Department's Historical Securities Division coordinated with Harwick and a team of specialists who came to the mill to catalog and process the certificates in secure conditions. They worked in batches, exactly as Wills had described, and the process was slow and precise and utterly without drama, which was appropriate. The bonds were what they were. The documentation was what it was. The accrued interest was what the calculations showed. The first batch redeemed at just over $41 million. Renata was at the hardware store when Harwick called to tell her. She was stocking a shelf of electrical conduit, the kind of wire routing work she had done as a licensed electrician years before, and she set down the box she was carrying and stood in the aisle and listened to him speak. The funds will be transferred to the estate account within 10 business days, Harwick said. The tax withholding has been calculated per Reyes's guidance and is being handled at source per the arrangement she set up. Your net from this first batch, after all applicable taxes, is $28.4 million. Renata looked at the shelf of conduit. She looked at the fluorescent lights of the hardware store. She looked at her hands, which were steady. Okay, she said. There will be 7 more batches, based on the certificate groupings we've established. The process will take approximately 5 months to complete. The total redemption, based on our current calculations and incorporating Reyes's tax structure, will net you somewhere between $240 and $260 million. Okay, she said again. There was a brief pause on the line. Ms. Voss, you're allowed to have a reaction. I'm having one internally, she said. She heard something in Harwick's voice that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly professional again. Fair enough. I'll send you the documentation on the first batch by end of day. She finished her shift. She stocked the rest of the conduit and helped the customer find the right-size junction box and rang up a purchase at the register. At the end of her shift, she clocked out and sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes and felt the size of it move through her like water through a millrace, slow and enormous and carrying everything with it. She thought about the $12.31. She thought about Maisie doing homework by the window because the ceiling bulb had burned out. She thought about the fractions worksheet and the motel off the interstate and the equity from the house that had been nothing and the data entry at the kitchen table at midnight while her daughter slept. She thought about Gerald in his basement, not spending, not telling, just building, year after year, with the patience of someone who understood that things worth having took time to assemble. She drove home and made dinner and helped Maisie with a book report on a novel about a girl who goes to live with her aunt in a strange house and finds something she didn't expect there, and she thought that Maisie might appreciate the parallel someday. And then she sat at the kitchen table after Maisie was asleep and allowed herself, finally, to think about what came next. She had been thinking about it in pieces since the basement, since the moment she had looked at the covered shapes in the dim flashlight beam and understood that what Gerald had built was real and was hers. But she had kept the thinking careful, had not let herself plan in specific terms, because planning in specific terms for a thing that wasn't fully real yet was how you set yourself up for the particular devastation of plans that didn't materialize. Now it was materializing. Now she could think in specifics. The mill was the center of it. She had known that from the beginning, had felt it standing on the main floor with the millstones and the old gear assembly and the smell of stone and machine oil. Gerald had maintained the exterior because he wanted the building to last. She wanted it to last for a different reason. She had her electrician's license. It had lapsed during the years at home with Maisie and the years after the divorce, when she had been too stretched to pay the renewal fee and sit the refresher examination. But it was not gone. The Pennsylvania Licensing Board had a reinstatement pathway for lapsed licenses that involved an examination and a filing fee and a period of supervised work. She had looked it up in the first weeks after she found the basement, during the nights when she couldn't sleep and sat at the kitchen table with the laptop. She wanted to reinstate her license. She wanted to do the work herself, at least some of it, the electrical work on the mill, because she understood what the mill was going to become before she had fully articulated it to anyone else, and she wanted to put her own hands on the wiring of it. She had also been thinking about the water wheel. It was intact. The iron rim was rusted, but the structure was sound. The mill historian who had come with Harwick's team had spent time with the wheel and told her that the bearing assembly was salvageable, that the paddles were in better condition than their appearance suggested, and that a wheel of this size and type, if restored, could generate between 15 and 20 kilowatts of continuous power from the flow volume of the Caro Creek. He had said this in the tone of someone offering a technical observation, not a recommendation, but Renata had filed it away. 15 to 20 kilowatts of continuous clean power from water that had been running past the mill for 175 years. She went to bed that night thinking about mill races and water wheels and the kind of thing a stone building could become in the right hands. The family's escalation came the following month, after Dennis apparently got further information from somewhere she never identified, enough to understand that the estate was substantial. He stopped calling Renata directly and sent a letter through his own attorney, a thinly worded document that expressed concern about the management of a significant inherited estate by someone without relevant financial experience and suggested that a family trustee arrangement might be appropriate. Renata handed the letter to Harwick, who read it and said that it had no legal standing whatsoever and that the appropriate response was no response. She also handed it to Reyes, who said the same thing in different words and added that if Dennis pursued this further, they would file for fees. Bev called again, this time not about Dennis, but about herself. Her tone was different, quieter. She said that she had been thinking about the $300 she had lent Renata in September and that she hoped Renata understood it had been a genuine loan and not a gift. I know, Renata said. I'll pay it back. With what's happening with Gerald's estate, I thought maybe sooner rather than later would be possible. I'll transfer it this week, Renata said. There was a pause. I'm not asking for interest or anything. Just the $300. I know, Bev. I'll send it. She sent $350. The $350 she had borrowed across 2 transactions and had tracked carefully in a notebook even when Bev hadn't asked for a formal accounting. And she sent it that evening from the hardware store wages and felt clean about it. Aunt Patrice sent a card. An actual card, paper, handwritten, expressing her delight at hearing that things were looking up for Renata and Maisie and mentioning that she had always thought Gerald had hidden depths and that she hoped Renata would remember that family was what carried you through life's difficult passages. Renata read the card and put it in the recycling bin and did not respond. What she did respond to was a message from a woman named Coral Sims, who worked in community development for Dunnfield County and had heard about the mill property changing hands. Coral's message was straightforward and without agenda. She had been looking for years at the mill as a potential community asset and had never been able to get anywhere with Gerald, who had politely and consistently refused to discuss it, and she wondered if Renata would be open to a conversation. They met at a diner in Dunnfield on a Saturday morning. Coral was 50-something, black, with the practical energy of someone who had spent decades doing the slow work of getting things built in places where resources were scarce. She had a folder of documents, and she put them on the table without ceremony. This county lost its last manufacturing employer 12 years ago, Coral said. We've been trying to rebuild an economy around agricultural tourism and small business since then, but the anchor infrastructure isn't there. We need a place where things can happen, where people can gather and work and learn skills. We've been watching that mill for years because the location is right and the structure is right and the water access is right. What did you have in mind? Renata asked. Honestly, we've been thinking small. Community meeting space. Maybe a maker space. Something modest. Coral looked at her steadily. But I'm hearing that the situation has changed. That there may be more resources available than we initially understood. There are more resources, Renata said. Then I want to tell you what this county actually needs and let you decide what you want to do with that information. Renata said, Tell me. Coral talked for 40 minutes. She talked about the schools, 2 of them serving the entire county, both underfunded. She talked about the unemployment rate, higher than the state average, concentrated in the 25 to 45 bracket, skilled workers who had lost manufacturing jobs and not found a clear pathway to what came next. She talked about the lack of vocational training infrastructure, the gap between a high school diploma and a skilled trade certification that nobody in the county had the resources to bridge. She talked about broadband access, still spotty in the rural areas where people needed it most for remote work. She talked about the creek itself, a resource that nobody was using, a potential source of clean energy that had been sitting idle for decades. When she finished, she looked at Renata and waited. Renata was looking at the folder Coral had brought. It contained demographic data and county planning documents and a map of the mill property and its surroundings. She had been looking at it while Coral talked, and she had been thinking about the water wheel and the mill race and the stone building and the 11 acres. I'm an electrician, Renata said. Lapsed license. I'm reinstating it. Coral tilted her head slightly. I want to restore the water wheel, Renata said, as a power source. If the historians are right about the generation capacity, it could power the building and potentially feed back to the grid. That's a demonstration of something, a real working example of microhydrogeneration in a historical context. That's a curriculum. That's something students can come and see and touch and understand. Coral was very still. And the building itself has 4,000 square feet across 2 floors, Renata said. I've been looking at what vocational training infrastructure costs, what the equipment costs, what the space and instructor costs run. I've done some preliminary numbers. What kind of preliminary numbers? I think you could run a full trades training program out of the mill. Electrical, plumbing, HVAC, carpentry. The stone outbuilding could be a separate workshop. The grounds are large enough for outdoor practical work. The water wheel project itself would be a live training exercise, students working on a real restoration, learning by doing. Coral set down her coffee cup. She looked at Renata with an expression that was careful and searching. Ms. Voss, are you telling me you want to build a trades training center? I'm telling you I've been thinking about it. I don't have a plan yet. I have a building and an idea, and I'm looking for someone who understands what this county actually needs. And the resources to do it. And the resources to do it. Coral was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I have been trying to build something like this for 8 years. I've written 4 grant applications and sat through 11 county commission meetings and been told no in more ways than I can count. And you're sitting here telling me you own the mill and you have the money and you want to make it a training center. I'm saying I want to think about it seriously with people who know what they're doing. Okay, Coral said. She closed her folder and looked at Renata directly. Then let's think about it seriously. They talked for another hour. Coral knew the landscape, the specific gaps, the programs that had been tried elsewhere and worked, and the ones that hadn't and why. She knew the county commission, knew who was pragmatic and who was performative, knew which state workforce development programs had funding available for exactly this kind of initiative. She had, in her 8 years of trying, become an expert in what was needed and why it had been impossible to build. She had never had a mill. Renata drove back to Harrisburg that afternoon thinking about Gerald, who had spent 40 years in that basement building something alone and patient and legal, and about what it meant that he had chosen her, and about the water while standing still by the creek, waiting for someone to clear the channel and let the water through. She had not told Maisie the full number. She had told her that the estate was significant, that their lives were going to change, that they were going to be able to do things they had not been able to do before. Maisie had processed this and asked 3 questions. First, could they get a dog? Second, could she have a real desk in her room instead of doing homework on the floor? Third, could they go back and see the mill? The answer to all 3 was yes. They went to the mill on a Sunday in December, 3 weeks after Renata's meeting with Coral. The day was cold and clear, and the creek was low and running fast, the water dark over its stones. Maisie stood on the wooden footbridge over the tail race and looked at the water wheel with the same focused attention she brought to problems that interested her. Is the wheel going to work again? She asked. That's the plan. Will it make electricity? That's also the plan. Maisie thought about this. For the building? For the building, and potentially for the grid. The creek has enough flow that the wheel, if restored properly, could generate real power continuously. Maisie was looking at the wheel. We could train people, she said, to do electrical work and stuff. In the mill. Renata looked at her daughter. Where did you get that from? Maisie shrugged in the way that meant she had been thinking about it for a while and had been waiting for the right moment. You said Gerald built everything in the basement himself. And you're an electrician. And it's a big building. And you keep talking to that lady from the county. She looked at her mother. It seems like the kind of thing you'd want to do. Renata put her arm around her daughter's shoulders on the cold footbridge. It is the kind of thing I want to do, she said. They walked around the building together, the way they had in November, except now Renata moved differently. With the confidence of someone who had made decisions about a place, who had thought about its bones and its dimensions, and what it could hold. She showed Maisie the cornerstone with the date. She showed her the orange paint on the northeast foundation corner, explaining what it meant and why Gerald had marked it. She showed her the north entrance and the mill pond and the silted channel that would need to be cleared before the water wheel could run. Maisie looked at the silted channel for a long time. That's a lot of work, she said. Yes, but it's the kind of work that has a clear result at the end. When the channel's clear, the wheel turns. When the wheel turns, the power flows. Maisie nodded as if this were a satisfying conclusion to a mathematical problem. Inside the mill, they stood in the main floor with the millstones and the gear assembly and the late afternoon light coming through the high windows at a low angle, laying long shadows across the stone floor. The lever on the east wall, with its red stop stenciling. The workbenches with their organized tools. The flour dust still in the corners. What happens to the millstones? Maisie asked. They stay. They're part of the building's history. Could they grind again? Not practically, but they'll be here. Students will be able to see how a mill worked, what the machinery was for, how people built systems for converting natural energy into useful work 175 years ago. Maisie walked to the lever and stood in front of it, reading Gerald's warning stencil. Then she looked at her mother. You never touched it, she said. No, even when you first came down and didn't know what was in the basement. The letter said not to. Gerald knew what he was talking about. Maisie reached out and touched the iron handle of the lever lightly with 2 fingers, not moving it, just touching. Then she pulled her hand back. Okay, she said. When the channel's clear, then we do it. When the channel's clear, Renata agreed. The second and third bond batches redeemed in January and February respectively, adding another $93 million to the estate account after taxes, structured per Reyes's guidance. The cumulative total was climbing toward what Wills had projected. The vehicles and artifacts were under separate management now, the military historian coordinating with several institutions, including the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which was interested in the collection in its entirety. The vehicle donation process, if Renata chose to donate rather than sell, would carry substantial tax benefits, a decision she was working through with Reyes and Harwick. The mill restoration planning had accelerated. Coral had brought in an architect, a woman named Fiona Marsh who specialized in adaptive reuse of historical structures, and Fiona had spent 2 days at the mill with a structural engineer and a mechanical engineer and had produced a preliminary assessment that confirmed what Harwick's initial specialists had said about the foundation and added a great deal of specific information about the adaptive reuse potential. The building was exceptional, Fiona said at their first meeting, which happened in Renata's apartment around the kitchen table because Renata did not yet have a proper office for these conversations. The stone walls were 22 inches thick, ideal for passive thermal management. The timber frame was intact and load-bearing and could support the weight of modern equipment on the second floor. The basement, already a controlled environment, was a natural candidate for server infrastructure or precision workshop space. The roof needed replacement, but the underlying structure was sound. The water wheel restoration was the most complex element. Fiona had brought in a specialist in historical water power systems, a retired mechanical engineer named Soren who had spent 30 years restoring mills across the Northeast and who spoke about mill races and head height and flow volume with the precise affection of someone for whom these things were both technical problems and matters of deep personal interest. Soren walked Renata through the hydrology. The Caro Creek at this location had a mean annual flow rate sufficient to generate, with the existing wheel diameter and a restored race channel cleared to original dimensions, approximately 18 kilowatts of continuous power. This was real power, not symbolic, not a demonstration in the sense of something that only worked for visitors. Real continuous generation that could power the mill building and, with appropriate grid connection, export excess capacity. The channel needs to be cleared, Soren said, standing at the silted mill pond with his boots in the frost-stiff grass. That's the main work. The channel from the pond to the head race gate is probably 4 feet of silt accumulation. Once that's clear and the head race gate is functional, you're looking at a 2-week wheel restoration, maybe 3 weeks to get the mechanical connection to a generator. And the lever? Renata asked. The one on the main floor. Soren had been briefed on Gerald's warning. Your uncle was right to leave that instruction. Before the channel was cleared, operating that gate would have pushed the silt accumulation through the wheel assembly under pressure. Could have damaged the paddles, flooded the basement, wrecked the bearing assembly. He understood the system. He left it sealed to protect it. He left it sealed for 40 years to protect it. Soren looked at the wheel. A man who understood patience, he said. The restoration planning moved through the winter with the deliberate pace of large projects that are done properly. Renata went to the mill twice a week, sometimes with Coral, sometimes with Fiona or Soren, sometimes with Maisie on weekends. She was learning the building the way she had learned her trade, by presence and attention and the slow accumulation of specific knowledge. She knew where every beam was. She knew the differential between the northeast corner, the one with Gerald's orange paint, and the other three. She knew the sound the stairs made in cold weather and the way the light moved across the main floor from morning to afternoon. She had started the reinstatement process for her electrician's license. The examination date was in March. She had been studying for it the way she studied for everything, systematically and without drama. At the kitchen table after Maisie was in bed, the textbooks open next to the laptop where the estate documents lived. She had also begun the process of hiring people. Not the attorneys and specialists, who were already in place, but the people who would actually build what the mill was going to become. A project manager, a restoration contractor with historical building experience, an education director who had spent 15 years building vocational programs at community colleges and was interested in the mill project for reasons that went beyond the salary. His name was Marcus Teal, and he had grown up in a county like Dunnfield and had ideas about what hands-on training could do for people who had been told that the pathway to economic stability had closed. Renata and Marcus talked for 3 hours at their first meeting, and she hired him at the end of it. She also hired a dog, or more precisely, she took Maisie to the county shelter on a Saturday in February, and Maisie spent 45 minutes going from kennel to kennel with the methodical seriousness she brought to important decisions, and then stopped in front of a 3-year-old brown dog of uncertain parentage with large paws and a patient expression, and said, "This one." The dog's name, per the shelter, was Rex, which Maisie immediately changed to Millstone, shortened to Mill. He was large and gentle, and he adapted to apartment life with the equanimity of a dog who had been in the shelter long enough to understand that equanimity was required. He slept at the foot of Maisie's bed. He had the desk Renata had bought for her room, a proper one, solid wood, with a hutch for her books and her notebooks and her growing collection of technical drawings of the mill. The family continued to surface with varying degrees of subtlety. Dennis sent another letter through his attorney, more pointed this time, using language about undue influence and contested probate that Harwick said was intended to create the impression of legal standing without actually having any. Harwick filed the appropriate response, and Dennis went quiet. Aunt Patrice sent another card, this one including a request, framed as a suggestion, that Renata consider including family members in whatever plans she was developing for the property, given that Gerald had after all been family to everyone. Bev called twice more. The first call was apologetic in the way Bev did apology, which was to acknowledge that things might have come across a certain way without quite saying that she had meant them that way. Renata accepted this. She was not interested in the architecture of her sister's feelings about the inheritance. She was interested in whether Bev would be decent going forward, and she thought probably Bev would, in the limited way that Bev had always been decent, which was to say genuinely concerned, but constitutionally unable to separate concern from the calculation of advantage. The second call was different. Bev's youngest, a boy of 12 named Theo, had been struggling in school, and his counselor had suggested a vocational assessment, and Bev was calling to ask if Renata knew anything about vocational programs, and whether she thought Theo might benefit from something hands-on. Renata talked to her sister for 45 minutes about what she was building at the mill. Not the financial specifics, not the numbers, but the concept, the idea of a place where people learned by doing real work on real systems, where the water wheel was not a museum exhibit, but a live project that students would restore and understand and eventually operate. Bev was quiet for a while after Renata finished. Then she said, "That sounds like something Gerald would have respected." Renata thought about that. "I think it is. He was always the one in the family who actually built things. Everyone else talked about doing things. He just did them. He did them alone." "Yes." Bev's voice was thoughtful. "He didn't seem to trust people much." "He trusted me eventually," Renata said. "In his way. He left instructions. He made it possible to find what he'd built if you followed the instructions carefully." There was a pause. "Renata," Bev said, "I'm sorry about Dennis. I didn't tell him to do any of that." "I know. And I'm sorry about the $300 thing. The way I brought it up." "It's okay. It's not really. Bev's voice was quieter. You were in a hard place and I handled it like a ledger entry, and I shouldn't have. Renata looked at the kitchen wall, the same wall she had looked at for 2 years of hard nights. You lent me money when I needed it. That was the real thing. The way you asked for it back, that's a separate thing. I'm still sorry. Okay, Renata said. Thank you. The fourth bond batch redeemed in March. The same week Renata sat the reinstatement examination and passed it. She drove to the mill the day after she received her reinstated license and stood in the main floor with the license in her jacket pocket and looked at the gear assembly above the millstones and thought about what it would take to run new wiring through a building with 22-inch stone walls. She knew exactly what it would take. She had spent the winter learning the building and the winter before that studying for the examination, and she understood the specific challenges of historical electrical installation in a way that most of the contractors Fiona had been speaking to did not. She was going to do some of the work herself. Not all of it. Not the heavy infrastructure work that required crew, but the detailed finish work, the kind of precise installation that required someone who understood both the system and the building. She had talked to Fiona about this, and Fiona had looked at her with an expression that Renata had come to read as Fiona recalibrating an assumption, and then said that having the owner on the tools was unusual, but that in this case, given Renata's background and the nature of the project, it made a kind of sense she respected. The channel clearing began in April when the ground had thawed enough to work. Soren supervised a crew with excavating equipment, working from the mill pond inward, extracting 20 years of accumulated silt and debris from the channel that ran from the pond to the head race gate. It took 3 weeks. The material that came out was thick and dark, the compacted memory of every flood and fallen leaf and eroded bank since Gerald had closed the gate and walked away. Renata was there every day that she could be, not standing watching but working, wearing the coverall she had kept from her electrician days, helping where there was a task she could help with, learning where she could only observe. Maisie came on weekends and drew the process in her notebook, page after page of documentation, the changing dimensions of the channel, the exposed stonework of the head race walls, the slowly emerging shape of a system that had been buried for decades. When the channel was clear, Soren walked its length with his hands behind his back and his eyes moving along the stonework, and at the end he turned to Renata and said, "It's in better shape than I expected." Gerald kept the head race gate closed, which protected the channel walls. The water has been patient. The water's been here for 175 years, Renata said. It knows to wait. Soren looked at her. Then he did something she had not yet seen from him, which was smile. The wheel restoration took 16 days. Soren's crew worked with the precision of people who loved what they were doing. The iron components cleaned and treated and were necessary replaced with period-appropriate fabrications that the blacksmith Soren contracted made by hand from reference drawings. The bearing assembly was rebuilt. The wooden paddles, more intact than they appeared, were reinforced where necessary and sealed against the weather. The mechanical connection to the modern generator that had been installed in the generator room off the main floor was tested and calibrated. On the morning they were ready to open the head race gate, Renata drove out from Harrisburg with Maisie in the passenger seat and Mill in the back, his large paws arranged carefully on the seat, and his expression patient and curious. Maisie had her notebook. She had been documenting the restoration for 4 months, and she wanted to be there for the final entry. Coral was there. Fiona was there. Marcus Teal was there. Soren was there with 2 members of his crew. The county commissioner had asked to come, and Renata had said yes. There were half a dozen people from the county she had met through Coral over the winter who had been watching the project with the cautious interest of people who had been promised things before and were waiting to see what was real. They gathered on the main floor. The gear assembly above the millstones, restored to operational condition, connected through its shaft to the water wheel outside. The generator room door was open, the equipment visible. The electrical panel that Renata had wired herself over 2 weeks of careful work was ready. Renata stood at the east wall with the lever in front of her. She looked at it for a moment. The red stopped stenciling. Gerald's careful warning underneath. Do not operate without clearing the race channel. Basement flooding hazard. The channel was clear. They had cleared it. They had done the work Gerald's letter described, exactly as he had said it needed to be done before they touched the lever. She looked at Maisie. Maisie had her notebook open. She had her pencil. She was watching her mother. Should I do it? Renata asked. Maisie considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then she said, "Yes, the channel's clear." Renata put her hand on the lever. The iron was cold from the morning air. She could feel through it, through the metal and the pivot plate and the stone wall, the Caro Creek on the other side. The water that had been running past this building for 175 years, patient and continuous, waiting for someone to open the gate. She moved the lever. The sound began almost immediately, the rush of water through the head race, a deep, wet sound that filled the building from below, and then the clank and groan of the wheel beginning to turn, the iron rim moving against its restored bearings, and then the gear assembly above the millstones beginning to rotate, the great teeth meshing in their ancient sequence, a sound like the building waking up from a long sleep. The generator came online. The panel lights came on. The building had power. Maisie made a sound that was not quite a word. She stood in the middle of the main floor with her notebook at her side and her head tilted back, watching the gear assembly turn, listening to the sound of water and iron and the slow revolution of something that had been still for decades and was still no longer. Coral was crying quietly, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had worked towards something for 8 years and was watching it begin. Renata stood with her hand still on the lever and looked at the light coming through the high windows and the dust moving in it, golden and slow, and felt the building move around her, the deep solid stone of it vibrating with the wheel's motion, alive in a way it had not been for a long time. Gerald had built this, had kept it, had sealed it and maintained it, and left it for someone who would know what to do with it. She looked at her daughter across the turning gear assembly and the moving light and thought, "We know what to do with it." The building hummed around them, patient and permanent. As the water moved through the race, it had been waiting to run again, and the wheel turned, and the power flowed. After a while, people began to move and talk. The county commissioner shook Renata's hand and said something about economic development that she nodded at without fully processing. Coral came over and hugged her without saying anything, which was more eloquent than anything that could have been said. Soren stood near the gear assembly with his hands in his coat pockets, and the expression of a man watching something he had worked to make real become actually real, which is a different expression from anticipation and requires a moment to adjust to. Maisie was writing in her notebook. She had been writing since the gear assembly began to turn, filling a page in her careful printing, and Renata waited until she looked up. "What are you writing?" Maisie turned the notebook. At the top of the page, she had written the date and below it, first day the wheel turned. Then a list of observations, the sound it made, the time it took from the lever moving to the generator coming online, the quality of the light through the windows when the dust started to move in the vibration, the way Coral had looked, the way Soren had looked. She had drawn a small sketch of the gear assembly in motion in the corner of the page. It was the kind of documentation Gerald would have recognized. The patient record-keeping of someone who understood that what you built only lasted if you also built a record of it. Renata looked at her daughter and thought about the homework by the window and the worn-out backpack with the broken zipper held by a safety pin and the 3 outfits rotated endlessly through the school week and Danny's mother's expression at the class gift and the motel off the interstate and the $12.31 on the debit card and all the other small, devastating specificities of those 2 years. And she thought about Gerald, alone in his basement for 4 decades, and about what it cost him to be the kind of person who did not know how to stay connected to people, but who could, in the end, find one person to trust with what he had built. She did not know what had made him choose her. His letter had said, "I'm leaving this to you because you're left." She had read that a dozen times, and still was not certain she fully understood it. Because you're left. Because you remained when others had gone. Because you were the last one standing in a particular place in the family's dispersal. Or something else, something harder to name. The quality of having stayed present in your own life, even when staying present was the harder thing, when leaving, giving up, deciding it was someone else's problem to solve, would have been easier. She had not left. She had worked 3 jobs and slept too little and borrowed $300 from her sister and paid it back and kept Maisie in school and helped her with fractions worksheets and brought her to a building by a creek and told her, "This is ours, and we are going to figure out what that means." Gerald had seen something in that, or had guessed at it, or had made a decision based on incomplete information and trusted that the person who found the letter and read it carefully and did not touch the lever and opened the basement door and looked at what was there would be the kind of person who deserved to find it. She thought she would spend a long time still understanding what he had given her and why. Outside, the Caro Creek ran over its stones in the April light, cold and clear and continuous. The wheel turned. The building stood. In the mill room, the gear assembly rotated with the deep, patient rhythm of a thing that had been designed for exactly this, and was doing it again after a long time away, and the light through the high windows moved across the stone floor in its slow morning arc, and everything that needed to happen next was still ahead of them. The training center and the students and the vocational certifications and the classrooms that were not yet classrooms and the workshops that were not yet workshops and all the slow, particular work of building something real in a place that needed it. But the wheel was turning. The power was on. The channel was clear. That was enough for today. The rest would come. The first cohort of students arrived on a Wednesday morning in September, 17 months after Renata had stood in the entryway of her apartment building and read a letter from a law office she had never heard of. There were 23 of them, ages ranging from 19 to 51, drawn from across Dunnfield County and 2 neighboring counties by the application process Marcus Teal had designed, which asked not for transcripts or prior credentials, but for 3 things: a description of work the applicant had done with their hands, a description of something they had built or fixed or made function again, and a statement of what they intended to do with a trade certification. The answers had been specific and unglamorous and completely honest in the way that answers are when people have nothing to perform for and everything to gain from being direct. A 44-year-old woman who had spent 12 years as a home health aide and wanted to become an HVAC technician so she could stop working nights. A 23-year-old who had taught himself basic electrical from YouTube videos while working at a gas station and wanted to do it properly. A man of 51 who had been a line worker at the manufacturing plant that closed and who wrote, in his statement, that he had never stopped understanding machines. He had only stopped having machines to understand. Marcus had read every application himself. He had selected for exactly this quality, the particular combination of practical intelligence and motivation that classroom metrics did not capture, and that was everywhere in a county like this one if you knew how to look. Renata was there when they arrived. She was not standing at the entrance to welcome them in any official capacity. She was on a ladder on the west wall of the main floor, finishing the last conduit run of the secondary electrical circuit she had been working on for 3 weeks, and she climbed down when she heard the buses and walked out to the yard in her coveralls with a conduit bender in her hand and introduced herself. She watched their faces take in the building, the stone walls and the slate roof and the water wheel turning slowly in the October light, the sound of the creek audible behind it. The mill pond, cleared now and full, its surface reflecting the sky. The stone outbuilding converted to the carpentry and plumbing workshop. The yard with its outdoor practical work area, gravel and level and ready for the kind of exercises that required space and fresh air and materials you could afford to get wrong with. A woman near the back of the group, the 44-year-old home health aide whose name was Patricia but who went by Pat, looked at the water wheel for a long moment and then looked at Renata. "That's what's powering the building?" she asked. "That's what's powering the building. 18 kilowatts of continuous generation from the creek. We're also grid-tied, so excess capacity feeds back. On a good flow day, the mill exports power to the county grid." Pat looked at the wheel again. "How old is it?" The wheel itself, in its original form, is from 1847. The components are a mix of restored original and period-appropriate fabrication. It was non-operational for about 40 years before we restored it. 40 years. Pat said it the way you said a number that required sitting with. 40 years, Renata said. She showed them through the building herself, not as a tour, but as an orientation, practical and specific, covering what each space was for and what they would be doing in it, and what the safety protocols were. She had given this same orientation to the instructor team the week before, a group of 4 working tradespeople who had been recruited by Marcus and who taught part-time while maintaining their own practices. She had insisted on the safety orientation being delivered by herself rather than delegated, not because she distrusted the instructors, but because she wanted the students to understand from the first day who was accountable for this place and what that accountability looked like in practice. In the basement, which had been converted to a precision workshop and electrical theory laboratory, she showed them the green metal cabinets, still in place against the wall where Gerald had kept them, now repurposed as tool storage. She had kept them deliberately. They were part of the building's history, and she was not going to pretend the history had not existed. She told them a condensed version of what had happened here. Not the financial specifics, not the bond portfolio numbers, but the shape of it. An uncle who had spent 40 years building something alone and carefully in this basement, who had left it to a relative he barely knew with a letter of instructions, and whose patient work had made everything they were standing impossible. The 23 students listened. Some of them, she could see, were trying to reconcile the woman in the coveralls with the conduit bender with the woman who was describing a several $100 million estate. She did not smooth this over or explain it further. The reconciliation was part of what she wanted them to take from the first day. The building runs on water power, she said. The water has been there the whole time. The will had been there the whole time. Everything that was needed was already in place. What was missing was someone doing the work of clearing the channel so the water could run where it was supposed to run. She looked at the 23 faces. That's what we're here to do for you. Clear the channel. The capacity is already there. Marcus told her afterward that 3 people had cried during that part of the orientation. She said she hadn't noticed. He said that was probably why it worked. The training program ran on a schedule that Marcus had designed with the specificity of someone who understood that structure was not a constraint for people in difficult circumstances, but a support. Classes 5 days a week, 2 disciplines per day, rotating through electrical, plumbing, HVAC, and carpentry on a schedule calibrated to the certification examination timelines. The hands-on component was not supplementary. It was primary. Students spent more time on the tools than in the classroom, more time solving real problems in the mill building and its grounds than solving hypothetical ones on paper. This was deliberate. Renata and Marcus had argued about the curriculum ratio in the early planning, a genuine argument that lasted 2 meetings and required Coral to mediate. And what they had arrived at was a principle they both held, that the people coming through that door had already proven they could learn by doing. Many of them had been doing exactly that for years, self-teaching in garages and basements and on job sites, accumulating practical knowledge without the credentials to monetize it. The program's job was not to teach them to work with their hands. It was to formalize and extend and certify what they already knew and fill the specific gaps that self-teaching left. The mill itself was a live curriculum. The water wheel restoration had been completed before the students arrived, but the documentation was there, Soren's. Detailed records of every component, every decision, every failure and adjustment in the restoration process, available in the mill's reference library on the 2nd floor. Students in the mechanical systems module studied the head race gate mechanism. Students in the electrical module learned the grid tie system that Renata had designed and wired herself. Students in the carpentry module worked on the ongoing maintenance and improvement of the outbuilding workshop. And in the spring of the first year, when the creek was running high from snowmelt and the wheel was turning at its best capacity, Marcus organized the first student-led infrastructure project, the design and installation of a secondary lighting system for the mill pond footpath, solar supplemented and motion activated, specified and planned and installed entirely by students from the electrical cohort under licensed supervision. Renata did the final inspection herself. She walked the footpath at dusk while the lights came on in sequence ahead of her, each one triggering as she approached, the system working exactly as designed, and she thought about the $12 debit card and the burned-out ceiling bulb in Maisie's bedroom and the 4 hours of data entry at the kitchen table at midnight, and she thought, yes, this is the right thing to build. She did not think about this in a triumphant way. Triumph was not the register she operated in. She thought about it the way she thought about a circuit that tested clean, with the quiet satisfaction of a thing that was working the way it was supposed to work. The county commission had been watching the mill since the water wheel turned on in April, and the local paper ran a story with a photograph of the gear assembly in motion and a headline about hydroelectric power and historic preservation that was accurate, if incomplete. By September, when the first student cohort arrived, the commission had been in 3 conversations with Coral about workforce development funding and was in the early stages of a partnership arrangement that would allow county residents to access the program at reduced cost through a workforce development grant. This was Coral's work, the patient navigation of bureaucratic timelines and funding streams, and the particular politics of a small county government that wanted to be seen supporting economic development but was cautious about committing to anything that might not work. She had been building relationships with these people for 8 years. The mill gave her something real to point at, and the funding followed. The Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle completed its acquisition of Gerald's vehicle collection in October of the first year. The transfer had taken 9 months of careful coordination between Harwick and the center's curatorial staff, and had involved Renata making 2 trips to Carlisle to walk the center's director through the documentation portfolio, which the director had called, in a letter she still had, one of the most complete provenance records he had encountered in 3 decades of military artifact acquisition. The donation had been structured per Reyes's guidance to maximize the tax benefit while ensuring the collection stayed together and accessible to the public. The center had committed to displaying the collection in its entirety in a dedicated gallery, with Gerald Voss's name on the installation and a narrative panel explaining how the collection had been assembled and preserved. Renata had gone to see the installation in November, the month it opened. She had driven to Carlisle with Maisie on a Saturday, and they had walked through the gallery together, the vehicles and the artifacts and the deactivated firearms in their cases, all of it properly lit and labeled and contextualized, all of it carrying Gerald's name. Maisie stood in front of the half-track for a long time. She had her notebook, but she was not drawing. She was just looking. "He spent 40 years collecting this," she said. "He did. And now it's here where people can see it." "Yes." Maisie was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he knew that would happen? That it would end up in a museum?" Renata thought about Gerald's letter, about the line that said, "I'm sorry I wasn't better at being a person." About a man who had understood what he had built and had kept it legal and documented and intact for decades, who had maintained the exterior of the mill while sealing the interior, who had written a combination lock out of 2 years that mattered to the building's history and his own. A man who had understood legacy without ever being able to say the word aloud to anyone. "I think he hoped it would matter," she said. "I don't know if he knew how." Maisie wrote something in her notebook. She did not show Renata what it was. The bond redemption completed in the 14th month. The final batch transferred, and Reyes sent a summary document that laid out the total in a clean column of figures at the bottom. $253 million, net after all applicable taxes, in the estate account. Renata read the summary at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where she had read the electricity disconnection notice and done the data entry at midnight, and helped Maisie with fractions worksheets, and she sat with the number for a while. She had been thinking for months about what to do with it beyond the mill, beyond the operational costs and the endowment she had established to fund the training program for 20 years without external dependency. She had talked to Reyes and to a philanthropic advisor Reyes had recommended, and to Coral, and to Marcus, and to Patricia Cross, who had become something like a personal counsel over the course of the year, and she had arrived at a structure she believed in. The Gerald Voss Workforce Foundation. A straightforward name, deliberate. She was not naming it after herself. Gerald had built the thing that made everything possible. The foundation's work would carry his name, and its programs would carry the logic of what he had understood. That patient, careful work, done honestly, without shortcuts, documented and protected, was worth doing even if no one saw you doing it. The foundation's first grant cycle opened in January of the second year. 20 grants of between $50,000 and $200,000 each, awarded to vocational training programs in rural and post-industrial counties across Pennsylvania, each one selected by a committee that included Coral, Marcus, Pat from the first student cohort, who was now a certified HVAC technician working for a mechanical contractor in Dunnfield, and 3 other people who had direct experience with what workforce development actually required versus what it looked like in grant applications. Renata chaired the committee. She did not make the selections unilaterally. She was not interested in unilateral decisions about how other communities should spend money. She was interested in finding people who understood what they were building and giving them the resources to build it. The applications came from places that looked like Dunnfield, post-manufacturing counties where the plant had closed and the town had been trying to figure out the next chapter for a decade. Rural counties where broadband was still spotty and the nearest community college was an hour away, and the skills gap between what employers needed and what people had was real and widening. Small cities where immigrant communities had tradespeople who had learned their skills in other countries and could not get them certified domestically and were working jobs that did not use what they knew. The committee read every application. They made site visits to the finalists. They awarded 20 grants and wrote detailed feedback to every applicant who did not receive one. Feedback that was specific and honest and actionable, because Coral had insisted on that, and she was right. Pat read some of the applications in the committee meetings and said, more than once, that she recognized these people, that she had been these people, that the thing they needed was not complicated to describe, just hard to build. The mill ran. The students kept coming. The second cohort was 27 people. The third was 31. By the end of the second year, 61 graduates held trade certifications they had not held before, and 47 of those 61 were employed in their certified trade at wages significantly above what they had earned before, documented in the follow-up surveys Marcus ran 6 months and 12 months after graduation. 47 people. Not a large number in the accounting of programs that described their impact in hundreds of thousands of people touched or millions of lives changed. But 47 people whose specific circumstances had changed in specific ways, whose wages had changed, whose children's circumstances had therefore changed, whose sense of what was possible had been reset by the experience of learning a trade properly and being recognized for knowing it. Renata kept those follow-up surveys in a folder in her desk at the mill, which was now a proper desk in a proper office on the second floor, the same floor where the reference library was, with a window that looked out over the mill pond. She read the surveys when she needed to remember what the number at the bottom of Reyes's summary document was actually for. Dennis had gone quiet after Harwick's second letter and had not been heard from since. Renata neither expected nor sought a reconciliation. She was not interested in the choreography of forgiveness with people who had moved against her out of pure calculation. What she wanted from that part of her life was simply for it to be in the past and to stay there. Bev was different. Bev had come to the mill twice in the second year, once with her husband and once alone, and they had talked the way they had not talked since before the divorce, without the ledger running underneath the conversation. Bev's son Theo had done a one-week summer program at the mill, a week-long introduction to trades that Marcus had designed for middle schoolers, and had come back talking about the water wheel with an enthusiasm Bev said she had not seen from him about anything academic in 2 years. He was considering electrical when he was old enough to certify. Renata said she would be glad to advise him. She did not tell Bev that she thought about Gerald when she thought about family, about what it cost a person to decide that the people around them could not be trusted with what they had built. She had not made that decision. She had made a different one, to be careful about who she let close and why, to trust people on the basis of what they actually did rather than what they said they felt, to build relationships the way she built circuits, checking each connection for integrity before she put power through it. Maisie was 10 now. She was in 5th grade at the school in Harrisburg, reading at a 7th grade level, working through a library book on electrical engineering that she had requested for her birthday with the same focused seriousness she brought to everything. She had a real desk and a real ceiling bulb and a dog asleep at her feet while she read, and she had a room with a window that looked out over the street, and she had, on the wall above the desk, a framed technical drawing of the mill's gear assembly that Soren had given her, signed and dated, with a note at the bottom that said, "For the girl with the notebook. Keep documenting." She came to the mill on most weekends. Not as a visitor, but as a presence, someone who knew the building well enough to move through it comfortably, to know which step on the main stair creaked and which window stuck in damp weather and where the tools were kept in the outbuilding workshop and what the water will sounded like when the creek was running high versus low. She had started, in the second year, attending the student orientation sessions. Not all of them, and not officially, but she would appear in the main floor when Renata was doing the orientation walk and stand at the edge of the group with her notebook and listen. The students, after the first time, stopped finding this remarkable. She was part of the place. She belonged there the way the millstones belonged there, not operational in the original sense, but present and essential to the understanding of what the building was. On the morning of the mill's second anniversary of the water wheel turning, Renata arrived before the students and the instructors and stood alone in the main floor in the early light. The gear assembly was turning overhead, the sound of it familiar now, the deep regular rhythm. She had stopped consciously noticing the way you stopped consciously noticing the sound of your own breathing. The light through the high windows was the low golden light of October again. The same light that had been there when she had first stood in this building with Harwick and realized what Gerald had kept here. She walked to the east wall and stood in front of the lever. The red stopped stenciling. Gerald's careful printing underneath. She had kept it. She had repainted it when the wall was cleaned, traced the letters exactly as Gerald had made them, because it was part of what the building knew about itself, and she was not going to paint over that knowledge. She put her hand on the lever the way Maisie had on that first visit, lightly, not moving it, just feeling the cold iron and what it connected to. She thought about all the mornings she had stood in other places before this one. The apartment kitchen with the disconnection notice. The hardware store break room on the phone with the attorney's office. The mill basement with the flashlight beam on the appraisal document and the number that did not immediately penetrate. The law office in Philadelphia where Reyes had said, "Your uncle knew what he was building and he protected it at every step." She thought about Gerald alone in this building for 40 years. Coming in through the front door he had locked, going down to the basement, working on his catalogs and his documentation, maintaining the compliance records, going back out, locking the door again, keeping the exterior maintained so the building would be here when someone eventually came for it, not knowing who that someone would be, trusting the letter and the combination lock and the warning stencil to do the rest. She thought about the channel. The 20 years of accumulated silt, the blocked millrace, the wheel standing still, the work of clearing it, 3 weeks of excavation, the crew with their equipment, the slow emergence of the original stonework. The moment Soren had walked the cleared channel and said, "It's in better shape than I expected." Everything Gerald had built had been in better shape than anyone expected, because Gerald had understood that what you built was only as good as how you maintained it. And he had maintained everything. The documentation and the compliance, and the exterior of the building and the sealed basement and the patient legal structure of the bonds, for 40 years, without recognition and without any guarantee that the recognition would ever come. She let go of the lever. Outside, a car pulled into the yard. Then another. The instructors arriving for the day. She could hear Mill, who had been sleeping in her office upstairs, get up and move to the window to watch. She heard the buses on the county road, the second-year cohort coming back for the second semester. She heard the creak and the wheel and the gear assembly and the particular quality of October morning light moving through stone walls that had been standing since 1847. She walked to the basement door and opened it and went down. The basement was different now. Bright, properly lit, the packed earth floor sealed under poured concrete, the shelves holding tools and testing equipment and reference materials rather than wooden crates. The green metal cabinets against the wall, repurposed, still bearing Gerald's cabinet labels underneath the new ones she had added on top. She had not removed his labels. She had added hers. The workbench where she had sat on the stone floor and read the appraisal document was now a proper electrical theory workstation with testing equipment and reference materials and a whiteboard where the instructor wrote the day's problems. She stood at it for a moment and looked at the space that had once held Gerald's 40-year collection and was now a place where people learned to do precise work with their hands. She thought Gerald would have understood this. Not the philanthropy, not the foundation, not the county commission meetings, or the grant cycles, or the newspaper stories. He would have understood the work. The specific practical discipline of teaching someone to wire a circuit correctly, to understand where the power was going and why, to test their work before they put it into service, to maintain the documentation so the next person who came along could understand what had been done here and why. She went back upstairs to unlock the front door for the day. Marcus was in the yard talking to 2 of the instructors when she came out. He looked up and crossed the yard toward her with the purposeful stride that meant he had something to tell her. Follow-up survey came back from the 3rd cohort, he said. 68% employed in certified trade at 12 months. That's up from 57% in the 2nd cohort. What's driving the improvement? Job placement network. The contractors we've been building relationships with are coming to us first now. They know what they're getting. A few of them have started contacting us before cohorts finish, reserving candidates. Renata nodded. This was the thing that took time to build and could not be faked. The reputation of the program, the confidence of employers that the people who came out of the mill knew what they were doing. You built it 1 graduate at a time, and then 1 employer relationship at a time, and then 1 year at a time until the referrals started coming in before you asked for them. The foundation grant cycle, Marcus said. The 2nd-year recipients. I've been looking at the impact reports from the 1st-year grants. And 3 of them have waiting lists. More applicants than capacity. They're asking if the foundation can fund expansion. Renata thought about this. Bring it to the committee in November. Let the committee see the data and make the recommendation. I'll set it up. Marcus paused. Pat's been talking to 2 of the first-year grant recipients about curriculum alignment. She thinks there's a case for a network structure, shared curriculum resources, shared employer relationships, coordinated certification timelines. Pat's right, Renata said. Marcus smiled. He had a way of smiling that was very spare, the smile of someone who had worked in underfunded spaces for long enough that seeing things actually work still struck him as something to mark. She usually is. Renata walked back inside. The students were coming off the buses now. She could hear them in the yard, voices and footsteps and the particular morning energy of people who were going somewhere they wanted to be, which was still something she noticed, and still, each time, thought was remarkable. She went up to her office on the 2nd floor and stood at the window that looked over the mill pond. The water was still in the early morning, reflecting the sky, the far bank still thicket with dried cattails from last year with new growth already showing at the base. The wheel turned in the mill's north wall. The creek ran. The sound was continuous and steady, and she had stopped consciously hearing it in the way she had stopped consciously hearing her own breathing, but she still knew it was there. She thought about what Coral had said once, in the early planning, when Renata had asked her why she had spent 8 years trying to build something in a county that kept telling her no. Coral had thought about it for a moment and then said, because the people are here. They didn't leave when the plant closed. They stayed, and they're still here, and they still have the same hands and the same minds they had before, and somebody should build something worthy of that. Renata looked at the mill pond and thought about Gerald, who had been a machinist and a veteran and a man who preferred his own company, who had understood that what you built lasted longer than you did, and that the quality of your building was the only reputation that mattered. She thought about a 9-year-old girl doing homework by the window because the ceiling bulb had burned out and the replacement was one of those purchases that kept getting pushed to next week. She thought about the motel off the interstate and the Ford that burned oil slowly and the $12.31. She thought about a letter that arrived in a cream-colored envelope and a sealed basement door and a combination made from 2 years that mattered and a warning stenciled in red on an iron lever and the sound of a water wheel beginning to turn after 40 years of stillness. She thought about all the channels that needed clearing, the silt of circumstance and bad luck and other people's decisions and the accumulated weight of years that went wrong. The work of clearing them, slow and specific and not particularly dramatic, just the consistent application of effort to the thing that was actually blocked. She thought about what happened when the channel was clear. The water went where it was supposed to go. The wheel turned. The power flowed. The lights came on in buildings that had been dark. She picked up her phone and called Maisie's school to confirm the after-school pickup time, then put the phone down and picked up the day's first file, a grant application from a program in Luzerne County that had been building a plumbing training initiative in a converted warehouse and needed 2 years of operational funding to get to self-sufficiency. She read it the way she read everything, carefully and without rushing, looking for the specific details that told you whether someone understood what they were building or only thought they did. This one knew. The budget was tight and honest. The curriculum was specific. The instructor credentials were real. The employer relationships were documented. The applicant had included, at the end, a paragraph that was not required by the application guidelines, but that they had apparently felt needed to be said, that the people in their county had been told for a decade that manufacturing was dead and trades were a consolation prize for people who couldn't do better, and that what they were trying to build was evidence that this was wrong, that the hands that had run the machines in the plant were the same hands that could wire a building or run a pipe or diagnose a system failure, that the capacity had always been there, that what it needed was someone willing to clear the channel. Renata read that paragraph twice. Then she put the application in the yes stack and picked up the next one. Downstairs, the building filled with the sounds of the day, tools and voices, and the particular focused noise of people doing real work on real problems in a real place. The water wheel turned in the mill's north wall. The creek ran over its stones in the October light. The gear assembly made its deep, patient sound above the millstones that had been grinding grain since 1847 and were resting now but present, holding the building's history in their worn granite faces, available to anyone who wanted to understand where this had all come from and what it had taken to keep it. Gerald Voss had built something alone in a stone basement for 40 years and had left instructions for how to find it. He had trusted that the right person would read the instructions carefully and not touch the lever until the channel was clear. The channel was clear. The lever had been moved. The wheel was turning and the lights were on, and the people were here, and the work was the same work it had always been, slow and specific and honest, done in the knowledge that what you built outlasted you, that the only reputation that survived was the quality of what you made. That patience was not the same as passivity, that keeping something intact and legal and documented through 40 years of solitude was its own form of devotion, the kind that did not require an audience or a reward or even the certainty that anyone would ever come. Someone had come. She had read the letter and found the combination and opened the door and looked at what was there without flinching. She had cleared the channel and moved the lever and stood in the main floor of a stone building by a Pennsylvania creek and watched the gear assembly turn and the light move through the windows and felt, underneath all of it, the deep solid truth that some things were built to last, and that lasting was enough. There was a moment, about 6 weeks into the first cohort's program, that Renata kept returning to afterward. She had been in the outbuilding workshop supervising a plumbing exercise when she heard raised voices from the main floor, not angry voices, excited ones, and she walked back through the connecting door to find 4 students gathered around the headrace gate mechanism on the north wall, the one Soren had rebuilt as part of the water wheel restoration, debating the relationship between the gate aperture and the wheel's rotation speed. They had not been assigned to study the headrace gate. They were on a break, and one of them, the 23-year-old who had taught himself electrical from YouTube videos, whose name was Cal, and who had already demonstrated an aptitude for mechanical systems that went well beyond the electrical curriculum, had started asking a question that pulled the others in. The question was, if you partially closed the gate, how much did the wheel's output drop? And was the relationship linear? Renata stood in the doorway and listened to them work through it. They got the basic hydraulics right by reasoning from first principles. They got the efficiency curve approximately right by extrapolation. Cal pulled out his phone and did calculations, and his numbers were in the right range. She did not interrupt them. She went back to the outbuilding and let the plumbing exercise wait and stood outside for a moment in the November air looking at the creek and thinking about what it meant that 4 people on a 15-minute break were voluntarily working through a hydraulic engineering problem. It meant the building was doing what she had hoped it would do, which was make the questions visible. The water wheel was not abstract. The headrace gate was not abstract. The relationship between the aperture and the output was something you could see and hear and feel if you stood in the right place. The building made the invisible principles of energy transfer and mechanical systems available to anyone who was curious enough to look at them directly. This was what Gerald had understood about machines, that they embodied principles, that a well-built machine was a kind of argument, a physical demonstration of something true about how the world worked. He had spent 40 years collecting machines and artifacts that embodied that argument in different forms, military technology from different eras, the specific ingenuity of people solving problems with the materials and knowledge available to them, each one a record of human understanding at a particular moment. She had not framed the training center in those terms publicly. She had framed it in the practical terms that Marcus and Coral and county commission members and grant committees understood: employment rates, wage increases, certification numbers, employer relationships. These were real and they mattered, and she was not going to romanticize what was also a very practical enterprise. But privately she thought about it the way she thought about the water wheel, about what it meant to make the invisible visible, to show people how the power moved and why, to give them the language and the tools to work with systems they had previously been unable to name. She thought about her own experience of becoming an electrician, the moment in her second year of training when she had understood, not just technically but in her body, the relationship between voltage and current and resistance, when the equations had ceased to be abstract and had become something she could feel in the work, in the tension of a circuit under load and the release of a circuit properly grounded. The shift from knowing about something to knowing it, from understanding it intellectually to being able to work with it fluently, the way you worked with language when you had spoken it long enough. That shift was what the program was building toward. Not just the certification, which was the measurable outcome, but the fluency, the embodied knowledge that made the certification real and lasting and transferable to situations the curriculum had not specifically covered. She went back inside and found them still at the head race gate mechanism, Cal's numbers on his phone screen, a small argument in progress about whether the efficiency drop was linear or followed a different curve. She said, "It follows a power curve. The relationship is not linear. Come find me after lunch and I'll show you the generation data from the last 6 months and you can model it empirically." 4 faces turned toward her. Then Cal said, "Can we look at it now?" She looked at the clock. She looked at the plumbing exercise waiting in the outbuilding. She looked at Cal's expression, which was the expression of someone whose curiosity had been ignited and who needed to follow it before it cooled. 20 minutes, she said. Then we go back to the plumbing. She pulled the generation logs from the mill's monitoring system, and they spent 20 minutes around the screen in her office, and by the end of it, Cal had built a rough, empirical model of the efficiency curve and tested it against 3 months of data and found that it held. He looked at the model on his phone screen and then looked up at her. "This is the same principle as transformer efficiency," he said. "The loss curve under partial load." "Yes," she said. "It's the same principle in a different physical medium. Energy systems share underlying logic across different implementations. That's one of the things you're learning here, not just how this specific system works, but how to recognize the logic when you see it in a different form." Cal looked at the model again. Then he said, quietly, the way people said things they had been thinking about for a long time, "I knew machines worked this way. I just didn't have the language for it." "Now you have the language," she said. In the 3rd year, Pat came back. She had been working for 18 months for the mechanical contractor in Dunnfield, had moved from apprentice to lead technician on a commercial HVAC installation, was making 3 times what she had made as a home health aide, and had come back to the mill to talk to Marcus about whether the foundation had considered a mentorship component, pairing recent graduates with employers for a structured 12-month follow-on. She had the proposal fully developed, a 12-page document with a budget and an implementation timeline and a section on outcome metrics that Marcus read twice and then handed to Renata. Renata read it at her desk with the window open to the mill pond and the sound of the creak in the wheel. When she finished, she put it down and thought for a moment. She thought about Gerald, who had spent 40 years building something alone because he did not trust people enough to involve them. She thought about what Gerald had not built, which was a network, relationships, the kind of interconnected structure that made what you built resilient rather than dependent on one person's continued presence. She had been trying to build that from the beginning, the committee structure, the employer relationships, the foundation grant network, Marcus and Coral and Fiona and Soren and the instructors and Pat. All of them people whose judgment she trusted and whose participation made the thing stronger than she could make it alone. Gerald had built something extraordinary in isolation. She was trying to build something that would survive her, that had enough roots in enough places that no single failure could undo it. Pat's mentorship proposal was exactly the kind of thing that served that purpose. A structure that connected the program's graduates to the employer community in a way that created ongoing relationships rather than one-time transactions, that gave recent graduates a person in their industry who knew their specific situation and could help them navigate the early years of a new career, that gave employers a stake in the program's ongoing quality. Renata approved the proposal and asked Pat to present it to the full committee at the next meeting and recommended they fund the pilot from the foundation's operational budget rather than waiting for a grant cycle. Pat said, "You don't want to wait and see if the committee agrees?" Renata said, "I'll put it to the committee, but I'm telling you now that I think it's right and I want to move on it." Pat looked at her with an expression that was part surprise and part something more complicated. The expression of someone who had spent years being told that the thing they wanted to build was not quite feasible and was adjusting to being taken seriously. "Okay," Pat said. "Let's move on it." The 2nd year of the foundation grant cycle funded expansion for 3 of the first-year recipients and 8 new programs, bringing the network to 27 training initiatives across Pennsylvania. The committee had started calling it the network, which was accurate. The programs were developing shared practices, referring students to each other when geographic or programmatic fit was better elsewhere, collaborating on employer relationships that crossed county lines. Pat's observation about curriculum alignment was becoming a formal working group. Coral was coordinating it from the mill, using the second-floor meeting room that Renata had furnished with the deliberate functionality of someone who had spent too many hours in rooms that were designed to impress rather than work. A long table, good chairs, windows that opened, a whiteboard on 2 walls. The working group met quarterly. The people around the table were program directors and lead instructors and, at Pat's insistence, graduates of the programs, people who could say plainly what had worked in their training and what had not, whose feedback was not mediated by any institutional interest in a particular answer. The graduates were the most useful voices in the room. They were specific in ways that institutional representatives were not, because they had nothing to protect and everything to gain from the programs being better. Renata attended most of the working group meetings. She sat at the end of the table and listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke it was usually to ask a question that moved the conversation from the general to the specific, from the principle to the example, because the specific and the example were where the actual knowledge lived. Marcus told her once that she chaired meetings the way she wired circuits. She asked him what he meant, and he said, "You figure out where the power needs to go, and you find the most direct path to get it there without anything catching fire." She thought about that. She thought it was a reasonable description of what she was trying to do, in the meetings, and in the building, and in the foundation, and in all of it. Finding the most direct path. Not the most impressive one. Not the most visible one. The one that actually moved the power to where it needed to go. Gerald had understood that. He had not done anything impressive with his fortune. He had built no monuments, sought no recognition, attended no functions, cultivated no relationships. He had simply worked, with the patience of someone who did not need the work to be witnessed to find it worth doing, and had kept his documentation in order and his combinations in the letters he left for whoever came after him. She was trying to work the same way, not invisibly, because the scale of what she was building made invisibility impossible, but without inflation, without the performance of philanthropy that turned the actual work into background for the story of the donor. The foundation's name was Gerald's. The stories it told were the students'. Her job was to keep the channel clear so the power could flow where it needed to go. In the spring of the 3rd year, Maisie turned 11 and asked, for her birthday, if she could shadow one of the electrical instructors for a week during her school break. She had been reading the electrical engineering textbook for 8 months and had moved on to a second one and had started spending time in the electrical theory lab in the basement when the students were not using it, working through problems on the whiteboard with the focused self-direction of someone who had found the thing they wanted to understand. Renata arranged the shadow week with the instructor, a woman named Jo who had been licensed for 20 years and who told Renata afterward that Maisie's questions were at the level of a second-year apprentice and that she should be thinking about fast-tracking the relevant coursework as soon as she was age-eligible. Maisie came home from the shadow week and sat at her real desk and wrote 6 pages of notes in her notebook, organized under headings she had developed herself, the headings not matching any curriculum structure Renata had seen, but making their own internal sense, the logic of a person who was organizing new knowledge against the framework of what she already understood. She showed Renata the notes. Renata read them carefully. "Jo says you asked good questions," she said. Maisie shrugged in the way that meant she was pleased but did not want to show it directly. "I had a lot of them. The best ones do." Maisie looked at the notes. "Uncle Gerald," she said. "Did he ever teach anyone anything? Like, did he have students or apprentices or anyone who learned from him?" Renata thought about this. "Not that I know of. He kept what he knew to himself. He worked alone." "That's sad," Maisie said. It was a simple observation, without judgment, the way she said things that were simply true. "It is," Renata agreed. "I think he knew that by the end. I think that's part of why he left the instructions so carefully. He wanted what he'd built to go somewhere. To us. To someone who would do something with it." Maisie looked at the notes again. "We're doing something with it." "Yes," Renata said. "We are." The mill ran on water that had been there for 175 years and would be there long after everyone in it was gone. The students came and learned and left with something they had not had before. The foundation sent money to places that had the people and the will and only needed someone to clear the channel for them. The wheel turned. The power flowed. The lights stayed on. Outside, the October light moved across the mill pond and the cattails bent in a breeze off the creek, and somewhere in the building a student was doing something right for the first time and knowing it, feeling the particular clean certainty of a connection made correctly, a system tested, and found working, a skill becoming real in the hands that were learning it. And the building stood, patient and permanent, the way Gerald had left it, the way stone buildings stand when they are built to last and tended with the care they deserve, holding everything that had happened here and everything that was still to come, in the quiet, particular way that buildings hold things, without drama or announcement, simply by remaining. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.